Hi, my name is Saeed Mia, and in this video I'm going to be explaining the intent, motivation, structure, consequences, and known uses of the null object design pattern. I will also be showing you a demonstration of a console app I built using this design pattern. The intent of the null object design pattern is to provide a way to simplify the use of dependencies that can be null or undefined. This is done by encapsulating the absence of a real object with that of a null object, instead of just giving it a null reference. The null object implements the same interface as the real object, but it contains default do-nothing behavior. The do-nothing behavior depends on what the client is expecting. Motivation. When objects have the possibility of being null, null checks are going to be required to prevent the app from crashing. This can result in a lot of null checks throughout your code. However, the null object pattern can eliminate that. It abstracts the process of handling a null so you don't have to worry about null checks. This is the structure of the null object design pattern. The abstract object is the base class for the different dependencies that the client may use. The real object is a subclass of abstract object whose instances provide useful behavior that the client expects. The null object is also a subclass of the abstract object, but its instances provides default do-nothing behavior that can still work with the client. And again, do-nothing behavior depends on what the client is expecting. Here are the advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of using a null object pattern is that it simplifies the client code. The client can treat real objects and null objects the same. The client doesn't need to worry about handling null references because that is handled by the null object. So the process of handling nulls is abstracted away from the client and possibly many other places. The disadvantages of using a null object pattern are that it can be difficult to implement if various clients disagree with what a null object's do-nothing behavior should be. Also, it is important to note that a null object subclass must exist for every abstract object base class, which can take a while if you're trying to refactor a large program using this pattern. This pattern can be used whenever you have an object being returned and you have to check if the returned object is null before you access its different properties and methods. Instead of using a null reference, create a null object, which has the same signature as a real object but contains default behavior. An example of where a null object pattern can be used is for user accounts for a website. Many websites allow for users to create an account and get premium access to the website while also having the default option of using a guest account with limited access, where the guest account is just a null object with default behavior. For my demo, I created a console app in Visual Studio 2019, written in C#. The app asks a user for an employee's name, which will then be searched in the employee database, and if it exists in the database, that employee's information will be displayed. If not, default messages will be displayed instead. The employee database is just a class with hard-coded data. This app implements the null object design pattern. Here is a class diagram for my console app. The abstract employee class is my abstract base class. The real employee subclass is my real object class, and the null employee is my null object class, which will contain the default do-nothing behavior. Employee is just a class I created to make things cleaner. It contains 3 strings called name, position, and salary. The employee data class contains a list of employee objects, and it also contains a method called findEmployee, which searches for an employee's name in the employees list and returns a new real employee object if it does. If not, it returns a null employee object instead. And the null object pattern class is my client class, which is what the user will be interacting with. And here are the references I used to make this presentation. So here's my program. This is the employee class with the name, position, and salary fields. This is my abstract employee class. It's got an employee object and 3 methods. The sayHello method says hello using the employee name entered, and the getPosition and getSalary are abstract methods. The real employee is a subclass of an abstract employee. Its constructor takes an employee object and copies its values to its own employee object. GetPosition displays the employee's position within the company, and getSalary displays the employee's salary. Here is the null employee class, which is also a subclass of abstract employee. Its constructor sets its employee name to the name that was entered by the user. GetPosition says that you are not an employee of this company, and getSalary says that you do not have a salary with this company. So these are the default behaviors that I've defined for a null object. The employee data class has a list of employees and a static constructor that populates that list with hard-coded data. It also has the findEmployee method that will search for an employee in the employees list by name. If the name is found, then a new real object is returned. If not, then a new null employee object is returned instead. And finally, this is my client code. This part is just some helper information of how to use the app. Here I've declared an abstract employee called employee and a string to get user input. Inside the do while loop, I get the employee name from the user, and if the user input is X, we skip this code and exit the loop. If input is anything else, then that input string will be searched in the employee database and will return either a real employee object or a null object. Then we call these three methods to display some information. So now let's run the program. I'm gonna enter Sally, and since she exists in the database, I will be able to get her information. Same thing with John and Mike. But if I try to enter a name that doesn't exist in the database, a null employee object will be returned instead, and I will see the default do nothing behavior. And I press X to exit. So if I didn't use a null object, but instead returned a null reference, I would need to have a bunch of null checks in my client code to prevent the app from crashing. But since I'm using a null object, my client doesn't have to worry about performing any null checks. Thanks for watching.